Hello, everyone, and welcome to Thanksgiving week here on the Dairy Signal, just as well. And we're going to be talking about a topic that we might not enjoy, but it's something that's perfect for this time of year as everybody's doing year-end meeting wrap-ups, really thinking about what they want to come in the new year. And sometimes that brings a little bit of conflict, if you will. So we're going to be discussing everything conflict today, how to manage it, how to minimize it, and what can you do when it arises. But before we dive into that topic, let's talk about a few things that happened today in history. So we're going to go back to 1900s when first Mercedes goes for a test drive. So if you're a car fanatic, today was the first test drive of the Mercedes. It was in 1986 that Mike Tyson became the youngest heavyweight champion in history. But we are going back to 1718 when the notorious pirate Blackbeard was killed off North Carolina today. So a little bit about this pirate Blackbeard, because if you were like me, you thought it was just a fictional character, but turns out he actually existed. And his name was Edward Teach. And he likely began pirating in 1713 when he became a crewman aboard a Caribbean ship commanded by pirate Benjamin Herringbold. So in 1717, Herringbold, he actually accepted general amnesty by the British Crown and retired his pirate days, which led to Teach taking over. And his first capture was of a 26-gun French merchantman, and he renamed the ship to Queen Anne's Revenge, which served as a flagship of his pirate fleet of 4 ships and over 200 men for the next 6 months. So he had a short-lived career. And he got his nickname Blackbeard, actually, because he had a long, dark beard. So how fitting. But the interesting part of that is that it was said that he would light it on fire to intimidate his enemies during battle. So a little bit interesting fact there for how he got his nickname. But after 3 of his ships became shipwrecked, he was forced to desert those due to low supplies. And he actually went north to North Carolina, where he met the governor, and he agreed to pardon Blackbeard in exchange for his sizable treasures that he had accumulated over the past 6 months. Unfortunately for him, though, in North Carolina, their planters asked the governor, or talked with Virginia, which got the Virginia governor involved, and they actually wanted Blackbeard off the coast due to the ferocity of him and his men that were on the ship. And that resulted in a battle that ultimately killed Blackbeard. So did not end well for him, but interesting tale that goes along with the notorious character we probably have heard of before. And that works perfectly in today's discussion on conflict, because he sure had a few of those. And today we have with us Liz Griffith, who is a market development and human resource consultant with Encore Consultants. And we also have Tim Schaefer, who is a certified family business advisor, a certified mediator, and a certified professional business coach with Encore Consultants. So thank you both for being here with us this afternoon. We're excited to dive into this interesting topic because we all have experienced it before. So thank you so much for being here this week as we dive into this interesting topic.
Yeah. I'm laughing about the pirate. It's a little bit of conflict there.
And hopefully when we think about getting together with family over Thanksgiving and Christmas and such, that we don't think about conflict. But you know what? That happens, right? And we're going to talk about maybe some of this historical baggage and the conflict that gets carried on, maybe sometimes over generations. We've all been involved in conflict, and when we ask people, hey, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say the word conflict? It's almost always negative. But it doesn't really have to be this way. So we're going to spend some time trying to understand conflict, where it comes from, but most importantly, how to manage it, because really all great family enterprises, they have conflict, but they just deal with it different than the ones that the family businesses that tend to fall apart. So as we go through today, feel free to interrupt. Feel free to ask questions. We'll just pause and kind of take it as it comes.
So I think that's perfect. I just want to say before we dive into that about asking questions. If you are new to this platform, you ask your questions via Slido. If you're on a desktop device, it's just to your right. If you're on a mobile device, scroll on down and you'll see the area you can type in your questions. But yes, as Tim mentioned, we will be taking questions throughout today's episode. So type them in and get those expert opinions and advice headed your way. But back to you, Tim.
All right.
Okay, well, as Tim
Go ahead,
said,
Liz.
we're going to talk about what is conflict, and there's good conflict and there's bad conflict. And in reality, like Tim said, we have conflict every single day. And good conflict is really good for family dynamics. It's really good for the business because it means that you have the ability and the skills to really talk about and dive deep into those difficult issues that families who are experiencing, or businesses, more bad conflict, they just avoid, right? They're never going to go there because of all these other issues that are building up. So, on a farm, think about it. You have a talk about, where's the next generation going with the business? What are we going to build or expand next? Or maybe what are we going to cut out? And when you have good conflict, it doesn't mean that everybody agrees, but again, you can have that debate and you can listen and you can hear respectively what other people are sharing. So you have a way to get to the answer. But bad conflict is when, again, you really have no resolutions. You avoid it. You're always carrying that anger. I think of stories like we all have those friends that when they say, hey, Liz, that sweater is really crappy on you, I can take it because I trust them and I know them. But if someone maybe I have some different feelings about because maybe they've hurt me in the past, if they say that to me, wow, then that kind of emotion just builds up in me, and then I'm probably not going to be so easy to sit down and talk with them and listen to them. So again, good conflict and bad conflict. Good, it's going to happen, and you want that in your business.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. When we sit down and we say, oh, what do you, what are your meetings like? What do you discuss? And this and that. Oh, they're fine, but they're not actually. So sometimes your sign is what they're not discussing, right? So back to what Liz was saying is they just avoid it. So conflict isn't always that violent part, the yelling and the screaming and things like that. Often it's just avoidance. It's what they're not talking about.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you because we hear so many times from farmers that will say, oh, I can't bring that up. There's no way. I can't ask my dad that. I can't ask my brother that. Well, that's bad conflict, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent. So, when conflict is handled poorly, and it eventually the connections that we have with each other, especially in a family business or family enterprise, family farm, it severs those relationships, right? Those connections. And family, that's really what it's about. It's about connections to the past, the traditions and things like that. But there's also that connection to the future. And when there's poor conflict, those connections get severed, and eventually the works just kind of get all gummed up, and good ideas, innovations, they don't get discussed because people start taking sides, and it halts progress, and ultimately it can get very, very expensive, and as people aren't communicating, they don't trust each other. That's a bad deal. But if you think about it as an advantage, right? So if your family farm gets really good at dealing with conflict, the decisions will be much faster, probably better thought out, because you're going to be able to debate all the angles, not just the one that's in your own mind. And really start thinking about what's good for the entire farm, not just for yourself or for your, for your family. But just being able to have these debates without building the resentment. That's and if we cannot build up the resentments over time, back to Liz's point, having that high trust, man, what a win-win opportunity there.
So I want to jump in real quick because we just had a question come in, and I think this goes right off the point you were saying, Tim, with resentment. It reads, when some people have conflict, they get over it fast. Others, even when the issue is put to rest, hold on to the issue. What do you do with those who hold on to the issue?
That's a really good point. And this happens probably 100% of the time. There's always somebody that you hold on to that for whatever reason. It hurt you. It meant something that, you're just carrying that monkey on your back. The best way, and, Tim, you can add to this, but, is really building a better relationship. So taking a step back and going, okay, maybe we can't address the reason why of this resentment right now, but I can do a better job to communicate with them better, maybe spend a little more time with them, do something off farm, in the hopes that as time goes by, that resentment decreases, and maybe to the point that you can actually calmly discuss what that issue was to begin with. Why did it bring you, to such a bad place? Tim, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the question that I have in my mind is, okay, so it was, how was the question posed? It was dealt with, but some people hang on to it. Is that?
Yep. The issue was put to rest, but they still held on.
So I have a question. Was it really put to rest, or was there a Band-Aid put over it? One of the things that we're going to talk about is dealing with the root cause versus the symptoms. And so often we jump right on looking at the symptoms, and you have to really peel that onion and get down several layers to get down to the root cause of it. I'm going to guess that there was just maybe a Band-Aid put over it, or an idea that just because we discussed it, now it's over. Right. That's where my mind is going on that, is maybe it wasn't as put to rest as completely as what some people think.
And that can increase the resentment and the conflict because it was just a Band-Aid. So it's funny you jumped in with that question. That's exactly what we want to happen today. So as we dig further into this topic, we just wanted people to share, just like they did there, what scenarios you see playing out in your business as it relates to conflict. Maybe what questions, concerns do you see with your family? Because I think, I'm going to assume we all have a lot of the same conflict issues going on. So get those in there. We're happy to be interrupted and kind of talk through them.
Good. All right. So jumping from that, why does conflict occur? So we just talked about it a little bit. But so often we see the conflict, maybe it's a son fighting with a father. Maybe it's the dad that's still giving orders in his 80s. Maybe it's off-farm heirs who are claiming that things aren't fair. Maybe there's an in-law who thinks that their spouse is working too hard. So often these are just on the outside. It's not really the root cause. They're symptoms of a deeper issue. I was just meeting with an attorney here last week, and he said, boy, everything was going great until this one of the sons decided to leave the farm, and then it all blew up. And I said, oh, no, there were things for a long time. That was just that was just when it became manifest. So at the root cause of all conflict are unmet needs. People want to satisfy their own needs, and if you can figure out what your true needs are and the needs of other people within that conflict, what's really at the bottom, think of it in needs. So if you don't remember anything from today, understand your needs and understand their needs. Not necessarily what you want, but what you need. You'll go a long ways towards resolving conflict. Anything more you want to add, Liz?
No, I think it fits nicely into the next slide, as we talk about, what are the building blocks of conflict? It's needs is part of it, right? But there's really three things that we essentially see happen not only in a family business, but just in families or any business. And that's, for one, the interdependence, right? That's when we're relying on someone. Maybe it's dad is, the owner, manager, the son is now, right underneath him. They're still family, yet they're partners in a business. It could be, as Tim said before, the mother and daughter-in-law, and they're relying on each other. Maybe it's for daycare, book work, whatever, but that's a piece of the building block. So if something happens in that area, family or business, that can create conflict, along with, as Tim was just talking about, the needs. And so maybe in those interdependent issues, those needs were not being met, right? Maybe the book work wasn't getting done on time and the daughter-in-law feels she could do it better or faster. That becomes a need, but because they're intertwined, there's the interdependence. And then you have the triggers, right? The triggers is just something that could set it all off. It could be that one smirk. It could be that one look. It could be that one statement. And all of a sudden, whoa, things are hot. Conflict has boiled to the top of the pot.
Yeah. And, the interesting thing about these three building blocks is you need all three at the same time. If one of those is missing, conflict often doesn't occur. Doesn't mean that someone's need. Let's just say that the trigger doesn't happen. Conflict won't occur at that time. Doesn't mean that it might not occur later. But you got to have all three of these, happening at one shot.
Yep. And it's, that you can go to the next slide, but that interdependence, that's huge. And a lot of people say, boy, it's hard to work with family, right? Because there's so many things that happen. You've got the ownership, you've got the management, you got the family, but you're intertwined. And how do you make that all good? And as we talked about Thanksgiving dinner, right? If you're having issues at the farm about who's getting what pay or what decision was just made that maybe affects ownership or maybe affects management, and you think it has nothing to do with family, but when you get around that Thanksgiving table or around that Christmas tree, all of a sudden, because there was those triggers, the needs, the interdependence, things can happen that cause conflict to happen. And they may not say anything at the Thanksgiving dinner table. It's people that are quiet, right? Decide to go early, don't share much. There's something building up, and we've all seen that. And yeah. I'm part of a family dairy. I know how hard this all can be. And I'm just going to throw out a story that I remember from years ago where somebody was so mad at her in-laws, they were all part of a farm, that she decided, well, they're not going to see the grandkids anymore, right? I'm going to hold that back because that's something I can. And all that does, again, because of these dynamics, is cause more needs not being met, more triggers, and people are just unhappy, and that's where that conflict is really going to grow.
Yeah, it's this diagram really shows the strength of a family farm, family enterprise. But any time that there's overlap of roles that people play, there's a that there's a potential for conflict. So if you look right there in the middle, if somebody is family and they're an owner and they're day-to-day working in the farm, right, that's the highest probability of conflict. So, and it can get really confusing because people play so many different roles. Within the same day. So let me give you an example. Let's just say that dad comes to the son and he just makes a comment about the production being lower than what it should be. And so then the question is, is dad showing concern as a father? Is he showing, is he calling into question his son's management? Or is the father really concerned about his dividend or distribution check because he's looking to, ease off, right? It's hard to know. So that's just one example how much of a tangled ball it can get.
And it's not to say that we shouldn't be in business with our family, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We're just pointing out what can happen. Good things can certainly happen too, and we see that over and over again in the wonderful dairy farms here throughout the U.S.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about needs. You know what? Not everyone has the same goals in life, in business, and that's okay. Different goals. You can have different goals and still not have conflict. But there's a big if. And the big if, as long as both of those goals or both of those needs can be met simultaneously. So let me give you an example. Do we reinvest our profits back into the dairy, or do we pay out some of that? Right. One is more of a growth orientation. One is more of a taking money out. There's, that's just, do we take on a lot of debt, or do we play it more conservative? That different goals, and people go through different stages in life. And, the person that is 20 years old has a very different risk tolerance than somebody that wants to protect their cash flow into their later years in life. Goals and needs. Goals are probably the easiest thing to fix. The hard one is when you have incompatible values. Doesn't mean that they're different values. That's no problem. But when they're trying to coexist, so when something that's important to me, some core value that I have, if I hold it, then you can't hold yours, right? That's a problem, right? So if I can't grow the farm because you won't let me take on more debt, as an example, that's an example. One is high risk, one's low risk, whatever. There's no right or wrong. It's just different values. And sometimes it's money, right? There's just not enough money to go around to do everyone's pet project. And then we talked a little bit about historical baggage, and that's a big thing. And interestingly enough, sometimes we visit with people, and the grudge really isn't with themselves. It's within their father or their grandfather, right? It's like, well, this person did something to my grandfather or to my father, and therefore I'm going to carry it forward. Wow, that's just a super heavy load to carry around. And it really can do a lot of damage over time.
Yeah, I mean, that historical baggage, yeah, that's huge. And you see that a lot. It could be about a vendor, a vet, but it halts your ability to move forward. Yeah. So that's huge.
Before we move on to triggers real quick, I have a question about needs. So when we talk about historical baggage, when we talk about values not aligning or they're incompatible or opposing goals, when they are so opposing, is there ever a way to come to the middle? Or is it kind of I don't want to say a lost cause, because that's very negative and doom and gloom, but is it ever able to come to meet in the middle? Or are those just so opposing that it's better to cut losses and figure out what to do after?
Yeah, who wants to take that one?
I can already think of several stories. I'm going to say both. Because it really depends on the people, their personality, what they're really willing to change, hear, listen to, adapt to. I can think of, a family farm that their needs weren't being met. Everybody was all over the place, but finally, with enough work, they realized, that they needed some help and encouragement. They were able to come to these resolutions because they finally got to the points that we're going to talk about later, sitting down and communicating. But I can also think of another family. Boy, we went through everything. And at first, both parties acted like, yep, we're going to listen to each other. We're going to come to an agreement. Literally at the end of meetings, they walked away saying, yep, we all agree. And the next day, nope, completely 100% flipped. And at that point, that specific farm, the best thing was really to walk away, separate your businesses, do something different, because it wasn't going to happen, but we don't see that often. And I think that's key. Most people are willing. Wouldn't you say, Tom or Tim? Sorry. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, people are willing to look, but it is a absolutely do not move past. Do not try to go any further until you become till you work out the issues around values, because they will be in the background and they will muck everything up. So it's a very dangerous thing to move forward without coming some sort of resolution on the values. And I agree. I mean, it's always worth talking about and things like that. But after you work through it so much, sometimes you need to just separate at that point. And there's nothing wrong with it. But I got to tell you, some of the nastiest conflict that we've ever seen come around values. I mean, because they're so important to us, right? They're our identity. They're what makes us tick. So yeah, don't move forward without really addressing that.
And trust, and that goes along, because trust could be a value, and
Yep.
you see a lot fall apart because of lack of trust. So we're talking about, the building blocks of conflict and what are some of those triggers. And again, I'm hoping you can all visualize some of this as you think about, your own farms, your own families, maybe even your off-farm jobs. But some of those triggers are, when people abuse the power of authority, right? I'm the boss. That's why I say so. This is what we're going to do, rather than, sharing with everybody, getting opinions, getting insight. We see that a lot. Boss man may not even be there every day, but he's using that power of authority to run the business the way he wants. And then employees or children or partners, that could be a trigger for them. Like, oh, right? This is really getting me angry. Then, of course, there's the power of reward. And we may see this with a favored employee or with a favored child on the farm. Like, they get the best hours. Maybe they get more pay. They get the nicer truck. They get to make any changes they want on the business, but the next person has to jump through hoops, right? That can be a trigger for someone. And then on the opposite side, the power of punishment, right? Kind of what I was talking about with, you're not going to be able to see the grandkids. That's kind of abusing that, I'm going to hold them back because you're not doing what I want or how I want, and that becomes a trigger. We also see in farms, especially the multi-generational, the power of connections. And what we mean by that is maybe grandpa has, the one attorney or the one vet that he has used forever and ever, and whatever that person says is the holy grail, right? And the next generation are like, but hey, we've gone to PDPW events and DBA, and we're out there learning, and we've met these new people that we'd like to bring in, at least to meet with them. But because of that power of the connection, and maybe that banker or attorney or vet has something on them, or just it's such a tight relationship that, again, you're running into a trigger for conflict. And then, of course, the power of the expert, right? Kind of goes along with that power of authority. I know this is how it should be. I've been farming the longest. I know I'm right. And again, not having those good and sincere communication meetings, conversations where you're learning from each other. So really what it comes down to is how that power is used and abused can cause that trigger and conflict.
I've got I've got an example here on authority, right? So sometimes people the second generation, maybe they don't have any ownership, right? They don't have any ownership, but they have ideas and they want to expand or they want to do whatever. And so the people that actually have the ownership will say, well, let's put it to a vote. Well, everyone knows how the voting is going to go before it even happens because of who owns the shares, right? Some people don't own hardly any shares. And so, that can really trigger things off. But on the surface, oh, yeah, it looks great. We voted, Another one is, we talked about reward. And so often, that can cut both ways, right? People can be over rewarded. So let's just say that you have, four siblings all working in the farm, but one of those siblings just simply does not contribute like the others, and yet in fairness, right, everyone's paid the same. Sooner or later that is going to trigger some conflict somewhere, right? When people either don't pull their weight or they have a different set of values and they don't want to work 95 hours a week, whatever that is. So, but they're all paid the same. So compensation is kind of falls underneath that reward.
Kind of that Band-Aid you were talking to about, yeah, you're paying them the same, you're doing that, that's the Band-Aid, but in reality, that scab isn't healing underneath because different things are still happening.
Yeah. Yep.
So we had a question come in, and I don't want to skip over the summary, but I also want to make sure to ask this kind of in this area in which they did. And the question reads, when conflict occurs and doesn't end well, someone walks away and lets it stew, how do we come back together after it not going well the first time?
Go ahead, Tim.
Really applying logic is probably, going back to that person and applying logic while, is probably not the place to begin with that. Acknowledging how they feel, approach it on maybe a personal level before you delve into the logic of their argument versus your argument and things like that, and trying to change their mind. The worst thing probably you can do is to try to change their mind. First thing is engage with them as a person. Acknowledge that, that hey, it appears like you're upset. Would you like to talk about it? And just let them vent. Just let them get stuff out in the open. We can't think logically when we're all hyped up. We can't deal with conflict when when we're in a fight or flight mode. So you got to lower the temperature. Maybe give it a little bit of time, but not too much time. Otherwise, those grudges will start up.
I think we were talking about this the other day, Tim, and maybe I shouldn't bring it up, but I'm gonna. Sometimes when that happens too, and as Tim said, hey, I want to hear your side of the story. I want to hear what your concerns are. I know you're upset, but maybe you go to a place that's a little more public to have that conversation, a more relaxed environment. Maybe go to Starbucks and sit down and get a cup of coffee and be genuine and listen and communicate. Because sometimes when you have it in the place that you're most comfortable in, you might have the same, outcome, because it's easy to get hot. It's easy to get mad.
Yeah, we're actually a pretty big proponent of doing offsite retreats. And that's because it gets everybody there is no one person that's in their own element. So you're not standing before your dad's desk, he's sitting, you're standing, or vice versa, and having this conversation on his turf or on your turf, so to speak. So sometimes just getting out, getting away. Sometimes it means just going fishing.
Yeah.
So we've, so far we've had a pretty good definition of conflict. Conflict is never really resolved. right? Because there's always going, like, it never ends. It's like, wow, we got good at conflict. It's ended. We're never going to have it again. That's never going to happen. In fact, some of the best teams that we work with, the best family farms we work with, are really, really good at conflict. And they have it. They absolutely have it. So now, what are some of their tips and tricks, that they apply? So, are there any questions or scenarios that we want to jump in and maybe answer at this point, or should we just keep moving?
We had a couple of those that came through. I think this is a good time for people to type them in if they have any, but I know I can think of one off the top of my head. And so let's talk about that. I'm thinking like father-son dynamic, where you have a son or somebody, maybe it's not a son, maybe it's just another, one of their siblings or somebody's coming in and they are trying to gain more authority, and they're buying into the farm or whatever that looks like in that transition plan. But that older generation has a hard time stepping down, has a hard time letting go. And so there becomes a lot of conflict between somebody who's trying to come in and have more authority, and be what their father was to them in that situation, especially when it comes with employees and who do you go to and who do you talk to and who's the head figure. What do you do in those situations? Because not only is it family, but it's very much business intertwined in at that point as well.
Who wants to take that one?
Go ahead, Tim. I'm thinking of a story, but go ahead.
So actually the slide that's up right now, first of all, understand the needs. So what does dad need that he's still staying on, right? What does the son, understand the needs first. Always understand that first. But then after that, after you do understand the needs, there are some things that you can do. And that's actually number 3 on this slide, which is structural changes. So when you were talking through about where do the employees go and who do they talk to and things like that, when we talk about structural change, it's creating those defined roles and responsibilities. Hey, these employees answer to this person. This, the son has authority to make these sorts of decisions without talking to dad. And so you start building in that governance and roles and responsibilities and business governance and family governance. And maybe it's a meeting structure, right? So maybe it's, hey, we're going to meet once a week, every 2 weeks, right? You start building in kind of that cadence in that structure, and that goes a long ways towards, not letting conflict flare up. So one caveat on that, though, structure can never fix values-based conflict. More structure can actually do damage. So if you try to create so much structure, but their unmet needs and their value-based needs, it can actually be worse. But that's a whole nother topic. I just want to throw that out there. So.
And I don't want to take up too much time, but I was thinking of this story, and this was years ago, where it was that same thing. Son was coming in. The father was excited to have him come in, but then when it came down to it, just like you were saying, not letting him make decisions, really wasn't a part of it. He felt more like a worker. And for a while, he just let it fester. Well, then unfortunately, the father had a bad accident, and he was truly laid up for a while. And I hate for that to be the instance where somebody has a good conversation, but that's what happened in this situation. And sitting in the hospital room, that son really had a open heart-to-heart talk about how this was going. And I think it was that aha moment for the father, and they really had good communication, worked to make some positive changes, and it went better. Now, that's not what we want to see happen, but that scenario is pretty popular.
Yeah. We had another question come in. Part of me is in 2 parts here, so hopefully I read it well. It reads, I have a sibling I work with, but they don't see what I know or have to say seriously, or they don't take what I know or have to say seriously. I don't work full-time on the farm, but I'm there often enough. How do I get them to stop seeing me as a quote-unquote educated idiot when I know what I'm saying would help the farm?
That kind of all goes back to really the building of the trust, the connections, as we're going to talk about in these next slides, even the structural changes, right? Maybe it's meetings to share, to hear each other out, to make those decisions on how you're going to move forward. But then also, the personal development comes in, and we're just going to touch on this a little because I know we'll talk about it more, but that's where you make the decision as yourself that maybe I need to invest in me to become a better communicator, to become a better listener, to understand the dynamics of the farm, whatever it may be, but you invest in yourself so that you don't let that hot moment get to you as bad, because you've learned some things on your own person, your personality style, and how to maybe deal with it. I just think so much of that fits into it. You can't solve it in one thing. It really comes to building a stronger connection, that communication, and that trust.
Yeah, and so often, we only approach conflict from our own perspective. And so let me just back up. So as a mediator, one of the tools that we use is people sharing their perspective. We're not, we don't judge who's right or who's wrong. It's just like, what are the set of facts and feelings and everything that you're coming from? And what are the set facts and feelings you're coming from? How are you coming to your conclusion? And it sounds to me like between these two siblings, there's a gulf there, because they're not really understanding how they're coming to those to the conclusions that they are about the other person and about the situation. That's probably where I would start with that one.
Okay, thank you. I just want to remind others who are watching, you can still ask your questions and put in your scenarios. But for now, we will continue to move on.
Yeah. Liz, you want to take this one?
Yeah, well, we kind of already talked about most of it. So let's go to dispute resolution, which that's the next slide. And this is where you really don't want to end up. It's that forced bargaining. You just have conflict that to you or to your family seems unimaginable, that you're unable to deal with it. You can't seem to find that way to communicate effectively. And so you do things like mediation, arbitration, maybe even litigation, buying and selling. Maybe you decide, hey, we're done. We're getting out of this because we can't seem to get along. We can't seem to make decisions. And it's a solution, but it's not the one we want. And we don't see it often. And when we do see it, a lot of times people don't walk away feeling good. So it really didn't meet the needs when it comes down to it. Anything you want to add on that, Tim?
No, it's where family farms go to die, really. I mean, maybe not mediation, because we're looking for a win-win, but once it starts going down the arbitration and litigation stage, it usually, what you're doing in each one of those stages is you're giving up more control of the process, and you're giving up more and more control of the outcome. And so, and let's just take litigation. That goes all the way to court. Guess what? You're going to put the resolution in the hands of a jury, and it's very expensive. And so this is not our favorite, but I think we have to put it up here. Probably the single most effective tool is what we call connections, family connections. Liz brought it up a couple times, and the connections is really the preferred way of dealing with values-based conflict. We are less likely to assume negative things about the other person if we actually know them as a person, if we understand where they're coming from. Doesn't mean that we have to agree, right? That doesn't mean that. But if we can kind of walk in their shoes, but walking in somebody's shoes means that you're near them, and there's a family bond, a family connection. Family farms, right? There's that connection to the past. There's all the traditions and things like that. There's that kind of that shared history, the traditions. But there's also, looking forward, it's also crafting that shared vision for the family, making sure that those values are, that there's a connected, that the values are connecting you, the vision is connecting you, and that you're building up trust along the way. Some of the ideas there are family events, and it's tough, right? Families, like now we have cousins and maybe second cousins, and it gets harder and harder to do things. It doesn't have to be fancy, but just getting together, not necessarily talking business, just being together with some sort of structured event goes a long ways. And sometimes that's an offsite or something like that. Liz, do you want to add anything to that?
I do. I have a little story, personal story, years ago farming, and it's not so much we were an all blood family, but your family when you're running a farm, right? And it was we're family. But we had a disconnect between agronomy and dairy, and mostly because nobody understood what the other one did, right? As dairy, we're watching going, oh, they get all this time off just because harvest is done, or, dairy's going, you have too many things break down. What the heck are you guys doing? And so it's funny you bring this up because this was years ago. One of the ways I started to fix that was me and others to go spend time in others' roles. We'd go ride with the guy driving the chopper. They would come and ride with the guy feeding calves, just more of that time. And then, of course, some events where we got together, we were forced to talk and meet and share, and it made a huge difference. And I know I'm making that sound like a really simple dish I just put together, but it did make a huge difference because it gave us a better understanding. It's kind of that saying, walk in their shoes. We did that.
Yeah. Excellent.
So,
Liz.
Okay. Go ahead. Did you have something to say?
No, I thought that was an excellent example of, we can take a business principle of cross training and spending time together, but sometimes we don't apply those same tactics or those same ideas to ourselves and our family because we just kind of assume that, well, we're family, right? We know what each other thinks, and we just really take each other for, I think a lot of times we take it for granted. And that's really where things start to wither and die off. So Liz, why don't you take this one?
Fits nice into solution tool number 3, which is structural changes. And we alluded to it a little bit in the past here, but it's how the business is structured and how it operates. So if it doesn't have things in place, right, more triggers can happen. And what does that mean? Well, like family governance, how is everyone going to get paid? Do we all understand it? Is it fair? How are we going to make those big decisions? Is there a monetary value, that we say, okay, if it's under 1,000, you managers can make it. If it's over 1,000, then this is the policy on how we're going to discuss and make those decisions. It's also about communicating and meeting often. So having those meetings where you discuss, what's needed on the farm, what changes did you make? You have the right to make, but let's talk about them. So again, it doesn't cause a trigger where somebody gets mad going, I didn't know we did this. What the heck? So those structural changes can be really good. And that the family governance piece, I guess I can't express enough how important that is, especially when you have multiple family members involved and it comes to pay and it comes to time off and it comes to who gets what vehicle. To have that in place that you've talked about and you've all made the decision together makes things down the road a heck of a lot easier. And that can even go with how do we let the next generation in, right? So Bob's going to say, well, my sons have been feeding calves for 6 years, they get in. And the next person's going, well, I made mine, take internships and get a 4-year degree, but they should get in. So what's your policy? What's your family governance piece on how the next generation gets in?
Yeah. As you were talking, Liz, it's a story. It's true. Work through this with a family in that they're in their third generation, and over the years, they purchased various properties with homes. And somewhere along the line, for tax reasons, it became a really good idea to have the corporation own all the homes. And in looking at that, that was just triggering so much conflict because people didn't have a sense of ownership of where they were living. There was always a debate whether we should replace the windows or your shingles don't need to be replaced this year or why, different people had different standards of living. And so, that was just one example where you just went in there and made a structural change to say, okay, the farm is divesting of all the homes. And we're going to increase everyone's pay just a little bit so that they can have their own home. But it was a change that was needed because it was just an example of something that maybe worked once, but as the farm got larger, it didn't work anymore, and it was just triggering a lot of issues. So sometimes a process is all you need.
Yep.
So, question about structural change, and I think it's one that happens far too often here in the dairy community, is where the older generation doesn't even want to talk about that transition plan, doesn't even want to discuss it. And you have the next generations who wants to come in and needs to get this figured out. But what do you do in those situations? Because like I said, I hear so many stories of people who have fallen into this, or all of a sudden, like you said, the dad's in the hospital or they passed, unfortunately, and they are just left SOL, pants down in the water. Like they just don't know where even to begin.
I think Tim kind of, addressed it a little bit before when he said figuring out everybody's needs. So you don't just write a transitional plan, right? You have to come together and talk about your values, talk about your vision, talk about, how you want the future of the family business to look. But it's also a time for all generations to really share what they're concerned about, what they need to be happy, not just monetary, but in the sense of handing over authority and power. Those can be really good conversations. And it's nothing that happens quickly. It takes some time. But I think that's really important to implement a very effective transition plan. And, Tim, this is really your niche. So.
Yeah. And so, we can, on the outside looking in, just say, kind of like that whole neighbor looking over the fence, we say, well, dad needs to let go, or dad's power hungry, or he just, he runs everything with an iron fist. That may be what it looks like. But to Liz's point, we don't know. We don't know what dad's needs are. Dad may be, and we find this a lot, dad may be scared of opening up that can because he wants peace in the family. He does not want to open up that can of worms, and he's avoiding it out of fear. And fear isn't always logical. And so approaching this from a logical standpoint of, hey, dad, you're 75 years old and this and that might not be the right start. I would say start connecting and understand and having conversations about his history. Like, hey, what was important to you? Where do you see this going? Right. Start connecting on a personal, has nothing to do with the transition, because ultimately, let's face it, the senior generation has to open the door, because they're typically the owners. Like, you cannot force somebody to give up their power. And let's face it, whoever owns the shares has legally the most power. And so they have to be willing to open up that door into a process, and they have to feel safe doing it. They have to feel like there's more to gain by opening up that door than it is to have it shut. And so if it's scary, that door is going to stay shut. Did that answer the question, Amber?
I think it did. Yes. I will let you guys continue on.
Sure. All right. So Liz hit on it just a little bit. The last tool is personal development, because let's face it, none of us are great, awesome communicators all the time. We still have interpersonal issues. We don't always deal with conflict in the perfectly. And there's another thing too, is it's much easier to change ourselves than it is to change the other person. A lot of times when we get questions, it's basic, kind of embedded in that is, how do I get the other person to change? Sometimes you can't, right? And so you just simply work on your own skills, and that's the soft skills, right? It's how being aware of how you come across. There's various assessments for how people deal with conflict, and understand kind of your mode. Is it to compete? Is it to avoid? Is it to collaborate? So really understanding how you're coming across in the moment. There's another thing that when we look on personal development, and that is not creating these communication triangles. Which, let me give you a little hint. If you start seeing mom getting involved in a discussion that really should be between two sons, or whenever there's a third person in there to kind of soften the blow, so they're not talking to each other, they're talking through a third person, like that's a real sign that there needs to be some communication work there. Another thing is understanding your personality profile. There's Myers-Briggs. We use DISC a lot, and understanding the people that you work with and around you, because we can't tell you how many times we're going through this and people are like, oh my goodness, that's why they do what they do. That's why he's not pouting. He's actually just avoiding the conflict, or he's talking. Oh, that's why he's doing that. And then leadership development, ways that trust is degraded, or whether it's built up. It's big in business, but it's really, really big in family business, family farms, working on our leadership, communication, and interpersonal skills.
And it really helps, you invest in yourself. And like he said, you learn all these different things about your own personality and others, but it gives you the ability to learn how to flex them, so that we're not staying right in this box, because we've invested so much in ourselves and others that now we're like, hey, if I do this, if I flex just a little bit this way, we're going to have better communication. And it's amazing what can happen when you invest in yourself with those soft skills. So again, summary, when we're thinking about good conflict, it's good dispute resolution, right? Because you're going to have conflict. It's not going away. You have excellent connections, both with family and your team members. You've implemented some good structural changes as far as family governance, protocols. You're having, meetings that people know about and can count on, and you've invested in yourself and maybe your other team members as well. So all of those added together can really help you experience good conflict.
Yeah. So what are some tools? I mean, we've talked at a pretty high level, we've talked at, kind of a medium level, and hopefully people have been able to, you've all been able to grab onto some things, but it's like, okay, what can I do next? Like, what are some things that each one of us on this call can do next? Goes back to, when you're in conflict, try to understand the other person's needs. You don't have to agree with them. Just really understand what's important to them. Is it a values? Is it a goal? What is that? And then go ahead, Liz.
Interrupt you there. Don't be afraid to flat out ask.
Yep.
He says, identify the needs. You don't have to guess. Ask them. What is it you need? What would make you the most happy, the most comfortable? Sorry, Tim.
No. But and some people will be able to say that. Some people will need a little more coaching before they're comfortable saying it, maybe to their mother or father. And some people won't know, right? They'll just know that something's not quite right in their right. They won't be able to verbalize it. Another thing is just really ask yourself, and this is really a gut check. Do I really want to solve this conflict that for everyone's benefit? So it's a win-win, or do I just want to get my way? And let's face it, we all just want to, at times we just want to win. We just want to get our way. But maybe that's conflict that shouldn't happen if you only want to get your own way. So it's kind of like, before I enter in this, my motives have to be pure. And then last is, commit to having good connections and communication, creating that transparency, creating trust. Don't make assumptions about people's motives, and really work on the soft skills. So
I think we brought it right to the end.
I was just going to say, I think that's fantastic advice. But, as we are getting towards that end, or we are at the end, what are like one or two key takeaways you want people to be thinking about or doing? Because we had a lot of really good information, but those next steps, like you were putting in there, what's that one or two that just is that golden nugget?
I think what Tim just said on that last slide, am I doing this because I want everybody to be happy and work together, or am I doing it just for myself because I want that win? That's key. Step back and ask yourself that question. But then also the needs. Somebody's not agreeing to it because there's something not being met. Maybe you haven't provided enough information. Maybe you haven't answered all their questions, whatever it may be. But if you could just take the time, even in your head, to think about, there's something that is not being met there, I need to take a step back and think about that. And that's why we're having this conflict.
I agree. I can't add anything more to what Liz said. So perfect.
Perfect. Well, I just want to say thank you both for being here with us today. It has been a wealth of information, and I appreciate you just talking through some of the scenarios that came up as well. So thank you so much for both of your time.
Thank you.
I also want to say thank you to those who asked your questions and participated. We can't have episodes like this that are interactive and dynamic without your participation. So thank you so much for that. As well as thank you to Zinpro, who is our sponsor for the month of November. Zinpro has been pioneering and researching the development of trace minerals and innovative solutions to help improve animal health and well-being for over 50 years. So make sure to check them out at their website or on PDPW Prime. And speaking of personal development that we were talking about here on tools that'll help not only you, but your team, and within conflict, we have Dairy Managers Institute, which is coming up in, about a month away in December here. And it's all about becoming a better manager. There's 3 different tiers. There's tier 1 and tier 2 include simultaneous Spanish translation for those team members who prefer to learn in their native language. And it's a great way to gain more of those skills to not only help you, but your team as well. So make sure to set out, as well as next Tuesday, so a week away from today, we have Dairy Insight Summit, which is talking about what's happening in the world around us in agriculture, what's next, and some of those really critical and key issues to really be thinking about in what's going on around us. So make sure to check both of those out at pdpw.org to learn more. But for now, we are having a short week here on the Dairy Signal, so we can all celebrate Thanksgiving on Thursday, which means Dan Bossy and the crew at Ag Resource Company, they're coming back here tomorrow instead of Thursday. They will be here tomorrow for the Dairy Signal, so make sure to tune in to learn what's going on in the world of markets. But for now, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you here tomorrow on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.